The moment he saw the date, his entire past came crashing back in a way he could never have prepared for. Ethan Cole had built his life on control, precision, and decisions measured in millions of dollars. But nothing in his world accounted for the trembling hand of a stranger dropping a single sheet of paper onto the polished marble floor of his company's headquarters in downtown Manhattan. The morning had started like any other, with executives trailing behind him, voices low, schedules tight. The rhythm of power steady and predictable, until everything stopped when the young woman stumbled just a few feet in front of him, her worn flats catching awkwardly as her bag slipped from her shoulder and scattered its contents across the floor, drawing brief, annoyed glances from staff who weren't used to disruption, especially not here, especially not in front of him. And Ethan almost walked past her without a second thought, because that was who he was now, a man too busy to notice accidents, too guarded to engage with strangers. But then he saw it, a single image sliding across the floor and stopping right at his shoes. And something about it made him pause, not out of kindness, but curiosity, a rare break in his routine that he couldn't explain. And as he bent slightly, his eyes landed on the black and white image, the unmistakable grainy outline of a medical scan, an ultrasound, and for a brief second, it meant nothing, just another personal detail in someone else's life, until his gaze drifted lower to the printed information beneath it. And that's when everything changed. The date stamped in small, clinical text didn't just register. It hit him like a sudden realization he couldn't ignore, a date he knew far too well, a night he had locked away, buried beneath years of ambition and carefully constructed distance, a night that was never supposed to matter, never supposed to follow him into the future. And yet here it was, staring back at him from a piece of paper on the ground. His hand didn't reach for it, but his body refused to move, as if the world around him had slowed while his mind raced to catch up, to make sense of what he was seeing, because it couldn't be a coincidence. Not with that exact date. Not with the memory that came rushing back, so clearly it felt like it had happened yesterday. And he realized he was still standing there when the woman quickly knelt down, her movements hurried, almost panicked, as she gathered her things without meeting his eyes, clearly embarrassed. Clearly unaware of the storm she had just unleashed in the mind of one of the most powerful men in the city. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt something unfamiliar slip through the cracks of his composed exterior. Not anger, not annoyance, but something far more dangerous, something that demanded answers, even if he wasn't ready for them. And as she finally looked up, just for a split second, their eyes met. And in that brief moment, there was no recognition on her face, no sign that she understood what that single image had just done to him. But for Ethan, there was no turning back now, because the past he thought he had left behind had just found its way directly into his present, and it wasn't going to let him walk away this time. 6 months earlier, long before polished marble floors and tailored suits collided with unfinished stories, Sophia Bennett stood alone outside a small clinic on the edge of Brooklyn, the late afternoon air pressing against her skin as tightly as the reality she had just been handed, her fingers gripping a thin envelope that felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. Because inside it was proof that her life had changed in a way she could not undo, a future she had not planned but could not ignore. And as people passed her by without a second glance, she realized how invisible she had become, just another young woman standing on a busy sidewalk, holding on to something that would redefine everything about her existence. She had always believed she could handle whatever came her way, juggling part-time jobs, managing bills that never seemed to shrink, pushing forward with a quiet kind of determination that no one ever noticed. But this was different. This was something that did not come with instructions or guarantees. And for a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes and breathe, trying to steady the storm building inside her, trying to remember how she had even gotten here. It had been a single night, one that felt almost unreal now, a rare moment when she had stepped outside her routine, outside her guarded nature, when the world had seemed softer, kinder, and full of possibility, and the man she met that night had not belonged to her world. That much had been clear even then. Everything about him had felt distant and out of reach, from the way he carried himself to the quiet confidence in his voice. And yet, for those few hours, none of it had mattered, because he had looked at her like she was not invisible, like she existed in a way no one else had ever made her feel before. And when the night ended, it ended without promises, without numbers exchanged, without anything to hold on to except a memory that lingered longer than she expected. And she had told herself it was better that way, easier to forget, easier to move on. But now, standing there with undeniable proof in her hands, she understood that some moments did not simply disappear. They waited, quietly shaping the future in ways she could never predict. Days turned into weeks, and Sophia did what she had always done. She adapted. She found a small apartment she could barely afford, picked up extra shifts, learned how to stretch every dollar until it almost broke, and kept the truth to herself because explaining it felt impossible. Because how could she describe a life-changing decision that came from a night she could not fully explain? And slowly, she built a routine around survival. Doctor appointments scheduled between work hours, quiet evenings spent planning for a future she was not ready for. And through it all, she never tried to find him, not because she did not wonder, but because she believed he existed in a world that would never intersect with hers again. A world of glass buildings and private offices, far removed from late buses and overdue bills. And then, on a morning that felt no different than any other, she found herself standing in front of one of those very buildings, a towering structure of steel and ambition that seemed almost unreal compared to everything she knew, clutching a folder with her resume inside, reminding herself that this was just another opportunity, just another chance to move forward, unaware that inside, behind those towering walls, was the same man she had convinced herself she would never see again, a man who had already forgotten that night, or at least believed he had, because as Sophia took a deep breath and stepped inside, she had no idea that the life she had carefully rebuilt was about to collide with the past. Neither of them had fully escaped, and that a single piece of paper would soon force both of them to confront a truth neither of them was prepared to face. The moment Sophia Bennett stepped through the revolving glass doors, she felt it immediately, that subtle but undeniable shift in atmosphere that told her she had entered a world that did not belong to her, where every surface gleamed with intention and every person moved with quiet purpose. And for a brief second she hesitated, adjusting the strap of her worn bag on her shoulder, as if that small action could somehow make her blend in. But it did not, because everything about this place operated on a level she had only ever seen from the outside, and yet she forced herself forward, reminding herself that she had earned this chance just like anyone else, even if it did not feel that way. The front desk receptionist greeted her with a polite but distant smile, the kind that was professional but not warm, and Sophia gave her name, her voice steady despite the nervous energy building inside her. And within minutes, she was handed a visitor badge and directed toward the elevator bank, where employees in tailored suits stood in quiet clusters, their conversations low and efficient, and she kept her gaze forward, trying not to draw attention, trying not to feel out of place, even though every instinct told her she was. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside, clutching her folder a little tighter as the doors closed and the numbers began to climb, each floor bringing her closer to something she could not yet define. And as she watched her reflection in the mirrored walls, she barely recognized the version of herself staring back, someone who looked composed on the outside but was carrying a life-altering secret just beneath the surface. When the elevator finally reached its destination, she stepped out into a quiet hallway lined with glass offices and soft lighting, the kind of space that seemed designed to amplify authority without saying a word, and a woman greeted her, introducing herself as part of the executive team, guiding Sophia toward a waiting area with a calm efficiency that made everything feel rehearsed. And as Sophia sat down, she tried to focus on the reason she was here, the opportunity in front of her, the possibility of stability, but her mind kept drifting, replaying moments she could not fully control, reminding her of everything she stood to lose if things did not go as planned. Somewhere deeper in the building, Ethan Cole moved through his own routine, unaware of the quiet disruption that had just entered his space. His day structured down to the minute, meetings stacked, back to back, decisions waiting to be made. And yet there was a subtle tension beneath his usual composure, something he could not quite place, like a thought lingering just out of reach. And when his assistant mentioned a last-minute candidate being considered for a position, he barely acknowledged it, because people came and went in his world all the time, names and faces blending into the background of a system that did not pause for individuals. Back in the waiting area, Sophia adjusted her posture as the door across from her opened, a signal that it was almost her turn, and she took a slow breath, grounding herself in the present, reminding herself that this was just an interview, just another step forward, not a turning point, not a moment that would change everything, even though something deep inside her suggested otherwise. And as she stood, following the assistant toward the conference room, she did not notice the subtle shift happening just down the hall, where Ethan paused. Mid-step, his attention briefly caught by something he could not yet explain, a faint sense of familiarity that made him glance toward the corridor, as if some part of him recognized a presence before his mind could process it. And for a split second, the perfectly controlled rhythm of his day faltered, setting the stage for a collision neither of them saw coming. Because in a building designed for order and predictability, the past had just walked through the front door, and it was about to make itself impossible to ignore. By the time Sophia stepped into the conference room, she could feel her heartbeat steadying into something controlled, something practiced, the version of herself she had learned to rely on whenever life demanded more than she thought she could give. And she sat down across from two interviewers who greeted her with polite professionalism, their questions structured, their expressions neutral. And for a while, everything followed a predictable rhythm as she answered carefully, choosing her words with intention, presenting the strongest version of herself she could manage, someone capable, reliable, deserving of a chance. And yet beneath that calm surface, there was a constant awareness she could not shake, a quiet pressure reminding her that this opportunity meant more than just a job. It meant stability, security, a future she was trying to build piece by piece. Just outside the room, Ethan Cole stood in conversation with his assistant, but his attention was no longer fully present. That subtle sense of familiarity from earlier growing stronger in a way he could not ignore, and without fully understanding why, he asked a simple question about the candidate being interviewed, a detail he would normally dismiss. And when his assistant mentioned her name, something in his expression shifted, not recognition exactly, but a flicker of curiosity that refused to settle. And before he could rationalize it, he made a decision that disrupted his own schedule, telling his assistant he would sit in for the final minutes of the interview, a rare move that immediately changed the tone of everything. Inside the room, Sophia was mid-sentence when the door opened, and the shift was instant, the air tightening as Ethan stepped in, his presence commanding attention without effort, and she felt it before she fully registered who he was, that same subtle tension she had felt since entering the building intensifying in a way she could not explain, and for a moment, her words faltered, just slightly, before she caught herself and continued, determined not to let the interruption shake her, even as her instincts told her something about this man was different. Ethan took a seat without introducing himself, observing quietly, his gaze focused in a way that made people uncomfortable without him needing to say a word, and as Sophia spoke, he studied her with a growing sense of unease, because there was something about her that felt familiar in a way that did not make sense, not just her face, but the way she carried herself, the tone of her voice, something intangible that triggered a memory he could not quite reach, and the more he tried to dismiss it, the stronger it became, until it was no longer something he could ignore. The interview continued, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Every answer Sophia gave now felt like it was being weighed more carefully, not just for competence, but for something deeper, something unspoken, and she could feel his attention on her, steady and unrelenting, making it harder to maintain the composure she had worked so hard to build. And yet she refused to look away, meeting his gaze when necessary, holding her ground even as uncertainty crept in. When the interview finally ended, the room exhaled as if a silent tension had been released, and Sophia gathered her things, offering a polite thank you, before standing, ready to leave, ready to step back into the version of her life she understood. But as she turned toward the door, her hand brushed against the edge of her bag, and in a moment that felt almost insignificant, everything slipped, the folder tilting, papers sliding free, and before she could react, the ultrasound image fell, gliding across the floor with a quiet finality that seemed far louder than it should have been. and time slowed in a way that neither of them could stop. Because as it came to rest near Ethan's feet, the carefully maintained distance between past and present collapsed in an instant, and this time, there would be no ignoring it. The room fell into a silence so complete it felt almost unnatural, as if every sound had been pulled away the moment that single sheet of paper came to rest on the polished floor, and for a brief second no one moved, no one spoke, because there was something about the stillness that demanded attention, something that made even the smallest movement feel too loud. And Sophia's breath caught in her chest as she stared at the image lying just inches from Ethan Cole's shoes, her mind racing faster than she could control, calculating how quickly she could retrieve it, how little attention she could draw, how she could make this moment disappear before it turned into something she could not fix. But it was already too late. Ethan's gaze dropped slowly, not with urgency, but with a kind of deliberate focus that made the moment stretch even longer. And when his eyes landed on the image, something inside him shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. The faint unease he had felt earlier now sharpening into something far more precise, far more dangerous, because this was no longer a vague sense of familiarity. This was something real, something tangible, and as he bent slightly, not even touching the paper yet, just looking at it, his expression changed in a way that did not go unnoticed by the others in the room, though none of them understood why. Sophia moved then, quickly but not recklessly, stepping forward as if to gather her things, her voice steady despite the tension pressing in from all sides as she apologized, her words polite and controlled, but there was a quiet urgency beneath them that only someone paying close attention would catch. And for a moment, she hoped that would be enough, that he would simply step back, allow her to collect the image, and let the moment pass like any other minor accident. But Ethan did not move, not immediately, because his eyes had already found the detail that changed everything. The date printed on the ultrasound was clear, impossible to misread, and as it registered, it was not just a number to him. It was a memory, a precise point in time that connected to something he had buried deep beneath years of calculated decisions and controlled distance. A night he had dismissed as fleeting, insignificant in the larger scope of his life, and yet now it stood in front of him as undeniable evidence that it had never truly been left behind. The realization did not come all at once. It unfolded in layers, each second adding clarity to something he did not want to fully accept, and his mind moved quickly, reconstructing details he had not revisited in months. The location, the timing, the woman he had met under circumstances that felt almost disconnected from his usual reality, and as those fragments aligned with the date in front of him, the conclusion became harder to avoid. Sophia's hand finally reached the edge of the paper, her fingers brushing against it as she tried to pull it back into her control, but the moment lingered too long, the silence stretching just enough for tension to settle deeply into the space. And when she looked up, just briefly, she saw it. The shift in his expression, the way his composure had cracked, just slightly, revealing something far more intense beneath the surface, something that made her instinctively uneasy without understanding why. Ethan straightened slowly, his gaze lifting from the image to her face, and for the first time, the connection between them was no longer vague or uncertain. It was something he could not ignore, something that demanded answers he was not prepared to ask out loud, at least not here, not yet. And yet the question formed anyway, pressing against the silence between them, because the past he had dismissed was now standing directly in front of him, holding a truth that could not be explained away. And as the room remained still, waiting without realizing what they were waiting for, Ethan Cole understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was not coincidence, and whatever came next would change everything. No one in the room understood why the silence had stretched so long, but they all felt it, the subtle shift from a routine interview to something far more personal, far more charged. And as Sophia finally pulled the ultrasound back into her hands, she forced herself to move, to gather the rest of her papers with steady fingers, to act as if nothing unusual had happened, even though every instinct inside her was telling her otherwise, telling her that the man standing just a few feet away was no longer simply a CO observing a candidate, but someone who had seen something he was not supposed to see. Ethan did not stop her, not yet, but his eyes followed every movement with a focus that made it impossible for her to ignore, and as she straightened, clutching her folder a little tighter than before, she offered a brief, composed apology. Again, her voice controlled, professional, as if she could reset the moment by refusing to acknowledge its weight. But the tension did not fade. It lingered, thick and unspoken, and when she turned toward the door, ready to leave, ready to put distance between herself and whatever had just happened, his voice cut through the silence with quiet authority, not loud, not aggressive, but firm enough that it stopped her mid-step. He did not ask a question right away, and that made it worse because the pause that followed carried more weight than any immediate demand could have. And when she slowly turned back to face him, there was a shift in his posture, a subtle change that suggested he was no longer playing the role of distant executive, but something more focused, more intentional, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with unspoken questions neither of them fully understood yet. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice calm but edged with something sharper beneath the surface, asking her to stay for a moment, just a moment, as if that small request carried no consequences. But the way he said it made it clear that it was not really a request at all, and Sophia hesitated, just briefly, before nodding, because refusing did not feel like an option, not here, not now. And as the others in the room exchanged uncertain glances, Ethan dismissed them with a simple gesture, his attention never leaving her, and one by one, they exited, leaving the door to close softly behind them, sealing the room in a silence that felt entirely different from before, more private, more intense. Sophia remained standing, her posture straight but guarded, her mind racing through possibilities she could not fully piece together, trying to understand why this moment felt so significant, why the look in his eyes unsettled her in a way she could not explain. And across from her, Ethan took a slow step forward, not enough to invade her space, but enough to narrow the distance between them, enough to make it clear that whatever conversation was about to happen would not be casual or insignificant. His gaze flicked briefly to the folder in her hands, as if confirming something to himself, before returning to her face, searching for something he could not yet name. And when he finally spoke again, the question was simple, almost too simple for the weight it carried, asking about the image she had dropped, about how far along she was. But beneath the surface of that question was something far more complex, something he was not ready to say out loud. Not yet. And Sophia felt it immediately. The shift from curiosity to something deeper, something that made her instincts rise in quiet defense. And she answered carefully, choosing her words with precision, giving only what was necessary, nothing more, because she had learned the hard way that sharing too much could cost her everything. Ethan listened without interrupting, but the more she spoke, the more certain he became that this was not coincidence, that the timeline in his mind was aligning too perfectly to ignore. And as that realization settled in, it brought with it a sense of urgency he was not used to feeling, a need for clarity that clashed with the control he had built his life around. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole found himself standing on the edge of something unpredictable, something that could not be managed or negotiated, because the truth he was beginning to see was not just inconvenient, it was personal. And as the silence returned once more, heavier than before, both of them understood, even without saying it, that this conversation was only the beginning of something neither of them could walk away from. The silence that followed her answer did not feel empty. It felt charged, as if every word she had chosen so carefully was now being examined from angles she could not see. And Sophia tightened her grip on the folder in her hands, instinctively creating a barrier between herself and the man standing in front of her, because something about the way he was looking at her made it clear that this was no longer a simple conversation. It was something far more personal, something that was beginning to unravel in ways she did not understand. Ethan did not speak immediately, but his mind was moving quickly, piecing together fragments of memory with the information she had just given him, the timeline aligning with a precision that left very little room for doubt. And yet he hesitated, not because he was uncertain, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way he could not take back. And for a man who had built his life on certainty, this moment felt unfamiliar, unpredictable, and impossible to control. Sophia noticed the hesitation. The way his composure seemed to shift just slightly, and it made her uneasy. Because she could not understand why a question about her pregnancy would matter this much to someone like him. Someone whose world should have been completely separate from hers. And yet here he was, standing too close to the truth for comfort, asking questions that felt too specific to be casual. She straightened her posture, her voice calm, but firmer now as she added that the details of her personal life were not relevant to the position she had applied for, a subtle boundary drawn without confrontation, and for a brief moment, it seemed like that might be enough to restore the distance between them. But Ethan did not step back, because he could not ignore what was forming in his mind, not anymore. Instead, he asked another question, this one quieter but far more direct, asking if the father was involved. And the shift in the room was immediate, because this was no longer professional. This was personal in a way that crossed lines neither of them had agreed to, and Sophia felt it. Instantly, the tension tightening as her expression hardened just slightly, not out of anger, but out of instinct, the need to protect what little control she still had over her situation. She answered with careful honesty, saying that she was handling things on her own, that there was no one else involved. And while her tone remained steady, there was a finality in her words that suggested the conversation should end there. But instead of closing the distance, it only deepened the silence between them. Ethan absorbed her answer, but instead of providing clarity, it raised more questions. Because if what he was beginning to suspect was true, then the absence of another man in her life was not just a detail, it was a confirmation, and that realization shifted something inside him. Something that made the situation impossible to ignore or dismiss. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken truths pressing in from all sides. And then, just as the tension reached a point where it could no longer remain contained, the sound of a voice outside the door broke through, followed by a brief knock that interrupted the moment. And Sophia exhaled quietly, as if the interruption had given her a brief escape. A chance to step away from something she could not fully understand. But Ethan did not move, his focus still locked on her, because even with the interruption, the question remained, unresolved and unavoidable. And as the door began to open, neither of them realized that what was about to happen next would only complicate the truth even further, pulling them both deeper into a situation neither of them had planned for. The door opened just enough to break the intensity of the moment, and Ethan's assistant stepped in with a composed, but slightly hesitant expression, clearly sensing that she had walked into something she was not meant to interrupt, her voice calm as she reminded him of his next meeting scheduled in just a few minutes, a detail that would normally have pulled him away without hesitation. But this time, he did not respond immediately, because his attention remained fixed on Sophia, the unresolved tension between them outweighing the demands of his carefully structured day. Sophia took a small step back, using the interruption as an opportunity to create space, her instincts urging her to leave before whatever was building in this room turned into something she could not control, and she offered a polite acknowledgement, thanking him for his time in a tone that was professional but final, as if she was closing the conversation on her own terms. But before she could turn fully toward the door, another voice followed from the hallway, more confident, more familiar, and entirely unexpected. A man stepped into view, his presence casual in a way that contrasted sharply with the tension inside the room, his eyes landing on Sophia with immediate recognition, and without hesitation, he spoke her name with a familiarity that shifted the atmosphere instantly. And for a brief moment, confusion crossed her face before she recognized him, not as someone close, but as someone she had met in passing during the past few months, someone who had shown interest, who had offered help she had politely declined, someone she had never allowed to get too close. The man smiled, stepping further into the room as if he belonged there, glancing briefly at Ethan before returning his attention to Sophia, and then, without any awareness of the impact his words would carry, he said something that changed everything, mentioning that he had been looking for her, that they needed to talk about the baby, and the silence that followed was immediate and heavy, because in that single sentence, he had introduced a new narrative into a situation that was already fragile. Sophia's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a quick shake of her head, a quiet attempt to redirect the conversation, her voice controlled as she told him now was not the right time, But the damage had already been done, because Ethan had heard it. Every word, every implication, and for a brief second, something inside him shifted, not confusion, but a sharp, calculated doubt that cut through the certainty he had been building. The man, unaware of the tension, continued, his tone light, almost reassuring, suggesting that they could figure things out together, that he was willing to step up, and while his words might have sounded supportive on the surface, they landed differently in the room, because they introduced a possibility that complicated everything, a version of the truth that did not align with what Ethan had begun to suspect. And for the first time since seeing the ultrasound, uncertainty crept in, subtle but undeniable. Sophia finally turned toward him fully, her expression firm now, her voice steady as she clarified that there was nothing to discuss, that she had made her decisions, and while she did not elaborate, the message was clear: she was drawing a line, one that she did not intend to let anyone cross. And the man paused, slightly taken aback by her response, but not entirely discouraged, because he did not seem to understand the depth of the situation unfolding around him. Ethan watched the exchange without interrupting, his mind recalibrating, reassessing every detail, every assumption, because the presence of another man claiming involvement changed the equation in ways he could not ignore. And yet, something about it did not sit right. Something about the timing, the confidence, the lack of alignment with what Sophia had said just moments earlier. And as the tension settled into a new, more complicated shape, one thing became clear: the truth was no longer a straight line. It was layered, obscured, and far more difficult to uncover than he had initially believed. And as Sophia finally moved toward the door again, determined to leave before the situation escalated further, Ethan knew that if he wanted answers, he would have to go deeper, because whatever story was unfolding in front of him, it was far from complete. Sophia did not wait for another word to be said, because she understood instinctively that staying any longer would only pull her deeper into something she was not ready to face. And as she stepped past the man who had just complicated everything, her movements were controlled but purposeful, her focus fixed on the door as if reaching it would restore some sense of balance to a moment that had spiraled far beyond her expectations. And yet, even as she moved, she could feel Ethan's gaze following her, steady and unrelenting, a silent reminder that whatever had just begun in that room was not over. The hallway outside felt cooler, quieter, but not safer, because her thoughts were racing, replaying every second, every look, every question, trying to make sense of why that encounter had felt so different, why the man she had never met before seemed to see through her in a way that made her uneasy. And as the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside quickly, pressing the button with more force than necessary, as if urgency alone could put distance between her and everything she had just left behind. Back in the conference room, the silence lingered long after she was gone, but it was no longer uncertain. It had shifted into something more focused, more deliberate, and Ethan remained where he stood, his expression unreadable to anyone else. But beneath that calm exterior, his thoughts were aligning with a clarity that made it impossible to dismiss what he had seen. Because while the presence of the other man had introduced doubt, it had not erased the precision of the timeline in his mind. It had not changed the fact that the date on that ultrasound connected directly to a moment he could no longer ignore. The man who had spoken up earlier attempted to continue the conversation, his tone still confident, offering explanations that felt rehearsed, suggesting that he was ready to take responsibility. But Ethan barely acknowledged him, because something about the situation did not align. The details did not match the quiet certainty he had begun to form, and instead of engaging, he asked a single question, calm but pointed, about the timing, about how long the man had been involved, and the hesitation that followed was subtle but telling, just enough to confirm what Ethan had already begun to suspect, that this was not the full truth, not even close. With that realization, the uncertainty shifted into something more defined, not complete understanding, but direction, and Ethan made a decision without announcing it, without needing to, because for the first time in years, this was not about business, not about strategy or calculated outcomes. This was personal in a way that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. And as he turned toward his assistant, giving brief instructions to reschedule his next meeting, it was clear that whatever priorities had filled His day before no longer held the same weight. Outside, Sophia stepped onto the street, the noise of the city rushing back around her as if nothing had changed, cars passing, people moving, life continuing in its usual rhythm. But for her, everything felt slightly off, slightly unsteady, because she could not shake the feeling that something had shifted in a way she did not yet understand. And as she began to walk, trying to lose herself in the familiarity of movement, she did not notice the black car parked just across the street, its engine idling quietly, its presence subtle enough to go unnoticed. But inside, someone was watching, their attention fixed on her with quiet intensity. And as she disappeared into the crowd, unaware of the eyes following her, the situation she thought she had left behind was already expanding into something far more complicated, something that would not stay contained within a single room. Because the truth, once set in motion, had a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how carefully it had been hidden.